Welcome to Protegrity's Freedom to Innovate. We are here today to talk about cross-border data protection. My name is James Rice. I'm responsible for the customer solutions team here globally at Protegrity. I'm joined by Anthony. Anthony, why don't you give you a quick intro?
Hey James, hey everybody. My name is Anthony Camarano. I'm Principal Security Architect with Protegrity, and I come here with a background with a large multinational financial, about 23 years there, with some experience in operations, infrastructure support, strategy and planning, and then in the last 10 years, security architecture and engineering, both host OS and in the last 6 years data. And then as part of that, I also stood up and ran a data tokenization as a service and practice within the bank globally, and solved a lot of cross-border data protection things. And I think that's what brings us here today, right?
That is 100% it. We're going to talk about that data protection as a service. We're going to talk about cross-border data protection. Maybe to set a bit of context for those listening in, I really want to start, Anthony, and kind of talk through a bit of just definition. What do we mean by that? What's the business impact that it has? And then dive into the tech. We're going to definitely get into the technology. We're going to get pretty deep in that, but we'll start with maybe just kind of taking a step back. And that step back is, I want to get your opinion and your thoughts on just the need in general, from a more technical, from a more security standpoint. Why is cross-border data protection important?
Sure. So certainly for an enterprise and at enterprise scale, there are data flows that are moving across a tremendous amount of software, data flows that have to cross borders, that are under privacy regulations, that are under geopolitical data residency requirements. And I think this proliferation of trust boundaries as data is moving in and out of all of these systems really drove within the bank a strong requirement coming from all different lines of businesses, all different application teams for, how do we meet these complex issues, these regulatory requirements in a very simple and effective way, both from a technical standpoint and from a business standpoint.
And that trust boundary conversation, right? To me, is one that really drives home the fact that this impacts almost any multinational, right? Any company where data crosses borders, be them physical, be them logical. I mean, it could just be lines of business, for example, right? But I'm interested in your point of view. Why do you think the business gains from this? Like, what does the organization itself get by addressing this?
So, selfishly, because I come from security, there's a tremendous amount of the security side, all of the different compliance and regulatory. But what surprised me actually when we deployed this and started to onboard our applications and broaden the solution with our lines of business was the actual business enablement that it provided. Um, the amount of business opportunity that is blocked or is under review or otherwise can't be achieved or is being signed off as a risk exception was way more than I had expected. And so from a surprise perspective, from a business perspective, enabling all of the different opportunities and the lines of business and that was a big surprise to me. I didn't. I mean, there were use cases that I never could have dreamed up that we were able to successfully implement. So
And that's really where I was wanting to go with it because I could see to your point right around business enablement for a large retail banking institute, right? Things like security and fraud analytics. It can be important for marketing programs at customers, customer loyalty, or really any other business initiatives where you want to track or use data right across those privacy, across those trust boundaries. But you did mention very briefly at the start the security and compliance side. I'm curious on your thoughts of kind of some examples around that as well. Like, where can a company de-risk laws, rules, and regulations, for example, to help them as well? Like,
yeah,
what are the use cases?
yeah. So just so from a security standpoint, I mean, one of the ways we leveraged a service like this was in a lot of our log data. So call logs, our online banking log data that would come out of either country specific areas where you couldn't move since PII data out of country, or regional where you couldn't move it to region, but analytics platforms, fraud platforms, security analytics, may sit outside of those boundaries, right? And so a service like this really enabled, from a security standpoint, different analytics that we couldn't otherwise do, different views into where our risks may have lie, where sensitive data is coming from. So I think from a security standpoint, that's one. From a business standpoint, onboarding with third parties is always a difficult thing in an enterprise. So being able to de-risk a lot of that onboarding when you're dealing with sensitive data for third parties was a big one. Um, Doing business with SaaS platforms came up a lot. Anywhere from offboarding commercial cards to global wealth platforms to some private banking things to a big chunk of our marketing programs going into third-party SaaS. And so all of that is sensitive customer data. A lot of that is under different privacy regulations, and has to be protected as it's moved out of the systems, that it may be collected or otherwise consumed in.
And this also, I guess, kind of enables you to increase the speed at which you do these things, right? To onboard those third parties, to move to SaaS platforms, to migrate data to the cloud. So from your side, then, what's really kind of the highest value? What's the quick, tangible ROI, if you will, right, for an organization that's able to conquer these kind of cross-border data protection, data privacy challenges?
Yeah, and again, I'll come at it with the security view, and then what I think is the business view. So on the security side, clearly it's the lowering of your risk. So essentially, consumption is by way of consumption, you're meeting privacy requirements, regulatory requirements, security requirements. You're reducing your risk footprint, enabling a view you didn't have, right? So from a security standpoint, the more consumption you have, the better it was uh, for not only the business but for the organization. On the business side, uh, being able to short circuit a path into like business enablement, so into third parties, into SaaS and cloud, into data movement, being able to do that quickly, effectively, maintain compliance from a business perspective, um, had a I mean, just huge amount of benefit just in terms of like enablement, as we talked about, but also over competition. So markets that you need to get into quickly, markets that may have too high of risk, but now you can operate in them. So from a business side, that was good, and I think one of so talking about the way the deployment, the architecture as a service, the intent of that was to be able to do this in as broad a software stack, an architecture as possible. And so, really being able to go after what I call the 80% of these kinds of use cases in the company, um, being able to solve the kind of vast majority, and not worrying so much upfront about the edge cases, the 20%. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think let's dig into that. Let's get into the solution then, because I think when we talk about that 80/20 rule, which is I think a great way to get started, or a great way to get started. We're not going to boil the ocean necessarily. So how did you start? Like, what did you start with? What was the solution for you to conquer that 80%?
Yeah, and I kind of went through this earlier. So, I mean, the real crux of the problem was complexity. Complexity in the software stack, complexity in the number of countries, complexity in the data flows and movement. Um, so, as a central service provider, in this case, a security organization, um, you can't anticipate all of the massive scale that's going to be thrown at you. And so I think a key way to achieve this, or at least the tenets that we move forward with and that I stand behind, and I'll break them into three. So on the one hand, it's onboarding. So you need a very effective, efficient, frictionless way to onboard a large number of applications, a large number of different lines of business, development teams. And so that's sort of step one. And then step two is in the central provisioning. So, central policy management, having that risk view, being able to conduct your audits, meet your compliance and regulatory requirements, demonstrate control in the environment, reduce risk. That central area. And then finally is on the consumption side. So, really offering something super simple, something that almost any application, almost any development team knows how to interface with, knows how to develop with, and for us that was REST API.
And I think what's really interesting about when you wrap those things together, right? The point of being able to easily onboard and be able to do a lot of policy centrally, but be able to push that protection out from a REST API perspective. It's dynamic enough to be self-service, right? It scales to the hundreds of different diverse, complex environments that you need to be able to support. And so I'm gonna ask you to do a little bit of the commercial here for me, actually. So this is the only time, I promise. But I want to know specifically, what about Protegrity, right? What stood out when you were looking at Protegrity and when you went to market to find a solution for this to solve the bank's cross-border data protection challenges?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll answer that in two ways. I think that there's a tangible response to that, and there's the intangible response to that. So I'll take and so just a little history on this effort. I mean, I did go out in the market, look at all the talk to all the analysts, look at all the product, bring in a tremendous amount of vendor, do all the assessment, and it boiled down to so on the intangible side at the time, and even now, there was no product tech software vendor that offered this kind of a solution, that understood it, that talked it, and Protegrity came with a vision and a roadmap that really aligned with this kind of solution. And for the most part, most of the tech was there, and it was really just really working with a vision and a roadmap to deliver it. And on the tangible side, you make that decision, and it's never bad to have a breadth and a depth with the vendor you decide to make that decision with, and so the breadth, knowing that once we cross over that 80%, once we kind of consume the REST API, and we need to start looking at the edge cases, the 20%. What are the things that can't? Knowing that we would rely on all of the different tech integrations, and the breadth there was important. And then clearly, in a company like this, it's not just tokenization. So there's a need for anonymization. There's a need for encryption and masking and redacting, and all of the different ways that you have to protect data. And so again, there the depth, being able to rely on that and know that a year down the line, 2 years down the line, we weren't buying some other software stack to supply and do that.
Yeah, to be able to meet all the needs. I mean, I can see how a vast capabilities when it comes to how to protect data and where you want to apply that, right, being super important, especially for size, scale, complexity of a global bank. But right, when you were looking to deliver an as a service model, then right, what was really the most important parts there to be able to give an as a service? Because as we talked about, that breadth and depth gives us the 80 and the 20, but that as a service is really where you started.
Yeah, it was, and the self-service model was really, I think it was the vision for that as a scale thing, right? And it goes back to that complexity, and it goes back to how do you solve for the unknown. And so putting a service in place, putting the plumbing in place that provides all of your compliance and reduces your risk and meets all of your audit and regulatory requirements, but doing that in a way that enables and empowers your business and your developers. And there's a very simple consumption model via a REST API, and there's a very simple onboarding model. I think that goes into really self-service capability, and the core at that is to be able to kind of scale to the enterprise and uncover all those different use cases and software stacks and all of that. I think one key point that was part of this service and that allowed us to do this is this idea that we would make the service as dynamic as possible. And so regardless of the payload or the software stack or the data type or the protection method you want to use, all of this was self-describable as part of the dynamic REST API. And so we could onboard a development team, an application, a line of business, meet their requirements, whether it was in a country residency requirement, a legal requirement, a trust boundary to a cloud or a SaaS or a third party requirement, or even just a global requirement. We could meet that, and we could do it once. And that empowered the business, that empowered the developers to say, okay, now we can use this if my schema changes tomorrow, if my database changes the next day, if my software stack changes the next day, if my vendor changes the next day. All of these things are self-describable. They're in control, they're enabled. As a central provider, as a central service provider, you're just making sure all of the plumbing is there, the security is there, the compliance is there, and yeah. So from a self-service standpoint, that's the key.
And when you went to enable and create this self-service capability, right? What was the kind of scale you were talking about with number of apps, number of developers, number of countries you guys were looking at, and where was the value to those groups as well, right? I mean, I see the value for you. You get this centralized data protection, and you're ensuring that the most sensitive information is protected across the globe. Why do these other groups care about this as well, right? That when they're just trying to maybe deliver products to market.
Yeah. So I mean, just a word on scale. Uh, we're talking about over 100 countries, well over probably 10,000 developers, a massive development organization, well over 3,000 plus applications, not all dealing in sensitive data. So you start to scale down when you talk about that, but complexity, raised to the power of 10. Um, so most of these business opportunities, I'll say, in this kind of large scale environment, are generally, either being blocked because they can't do it for some reason, regulatory, geopolitical risk, or they're in the process of an ongoing process of trying to accept the risk, define the risk, um, get approval, get exception. There's like a board of approval that you have to go to. There's a 100-page set of documents that you have to define. There's a yearly acceptance of this risk that nobody really wants to take on. And so normally you would go out to these app teams, you go out to these developers, especially myself as a security organization, and I say, you're going to use this REST API. They'd look at me sideways and say no thank you, and carry on. But when I come to them and say, okay, you're involved in this process, or you can't enable this, $20 million save, or this, $30 million contract, because you're stuck in this process, or you can't take on the risk. Using this REST API, I can get you compliance, I can get you a mitigation, I can get you reduced risk. All of a sudden now, all the developers, all of the application architects, they all know how to make a REST API call. They all know exactly where they're going to make it in their, software flow, and how they're going to integrate, and it just opened the doors. And so from a value standpoint, it kind of, the pipeline just fills as a result, right? All of that opportunity.
So first they probably tell you, we don't want to do that work. But then you essentially presented on the easy button. Is that what it is? It's like, here's the easy button, and they said, oh, after all, maybe I could do that.
It is, and in banking, certainly, and in cross border. I mean, there are there are geopolitical things you simply can't ignore, you can't mitigate, you can't accept, right? And so, provide having a solution that gets you through those, it's big.
Nice. Okay, so with the time we have left, I want to go a bit deeper into the technology. Let's call this the lightning round. We're going to kind of go through some questions here. I want to hit a couple of tech topics and kind of geek out a bit with you, I
Five
guess.
second responses. Let's go.
Yeah, there we go. I'll give you a little bit longer than that. But so, how are you technically able to solve for that kind of root of trust, that privacy domain requirements that you mentioned previously?
Sure. So from a security standpoint, and certainly in the cross-border frame, they're at the very core of meeting some of the strict requirements of cross-border of data residency, are this idea of root of trust. And for us, the root of trust exists only in memory, in physical, in the authorized location. The authorized location in cross-border in this case would be a geopolitical physical border, right?
Hmm.
And so to meet that, we would essentially load the material that we need to do tokenization into memory, source a secret material out of something like an HSM, depending on the security level requirements of the solution. So the highest being out of an HSM, shuffle the material in memory in that physical location, and in that way, actually isolate from any other data protection point, from our management plane, from our support organization, the material that's then used to do protect and unprotect. And so in that way, we could deploy into any given country. In this case, for myself, upwards 4, 5, 6 different countries: Switzerland, Korea, Taiwan, uh, and meet the residency needs in that country, but then be able to move that data out to our fraud analytics and our security analytics and our third party, SaaS marketing. And so maintaining that root of trust physically in memory and isolating that protect unprotect point from all other avenues of compromise was key. I mean, so I went through an external audit by a security vendor in Switzerland, and the key tenet there is, even under a foreign subpoena, you can't reveal Swiss citizen data. And so we passed that through this architecture and many other internal and external audits as well.
What was it always for you country? Was there ever logical around like lines of business? Was
Mhm.
there regional, global? Like what were those other? Was it always country based for you?
Yeah, no, it was, so the country was probably the most strict, but then we would get legal or regional. So we did have a regional, like an EU region, a Europe region, an Asia Pacific region, North America region. We also had global, where you may want the service to operate in the same way, to provide you some referential integrity in the same way, whether you make that in the US or you make that in Europe or you make that in Asia, and all the different mixes in between, right? So we could stand up that trust boundary anywhere we needed to define it. It could be a logical cloud boundary, right? Doesn't have to be physical.
Gotcha. Now,
Yeah.
you also talked about Protegrity's depth of protection methods, and we hear this a lot, right? In one platform, having encryption and tokenization and data masking and anonymization and synthetic data, and basically a lot of arrows in your quiver, right, to address the different needs you have. That's important. But for you, right, especially with this 80/20, you landed on vaultless tokenization. Can you talk to me about why that was what you chose to implement?
Sure. Yeah. I think initially, um, we always had this 80/20. Let's go after the 80%. Let's keep it simple. Let's make a decision. Let's just go forward. And then, because of the depth and the breadth of the vendor, we were choosing, a Protegrity. Um, we could always put something in place when we needed it, right? But tokenization specifically was the first one we went with for a few reasons. So one is in the financial banking world, especially in PCI, which some of our initial use cases came out of. There's a comfort with tokenization. Okay, and so that immediately resonated with some of our initial use cases. Additionally, tokenization is a substitution algorithm using like a lookup index and a substitute, and so even in some of our regulatory things, there was a comfort in there, and then from uh, from an encryption key management standpoint, many of our existing businesses that may have been using encryption in different ways already were struggling with like key rotation and key rotation requirements. And so, the difference being, so in encryption, you've got a fairly short, depending on your, if you're using 256-bit AES or what have you. But so for 256, you have a 256-bit wide kind of random key, and there's a limit to the time it exists and the amount of data that it can protect, and it's done in some respects because of that finite length. And so when you think about tokenization, the number of permutations that you have in a given alphabet, like alphanumeric, is really approach infinite, right? It's not rooted in some hard problem that has to be solved. You're not bound to some fixed width key from an entropy standpoint. So you gain some quantum properties there. You gain some rotation capability there. You could do things with an alphabet in terms of format preservation that you can't otherwise do at scale in some other of those data protection technologies. And so it was like the combination of these things that it was like, okay, that's what we're going to move forward first and go with.
Yeah, we hear a lot of times too, right? The lack of shuffling keys, keys not being sent around, right, is a huge point to that
That's
as well.
actually, yeah, that's a good point actually as well. So in the context of tokenization and traditionally in finance and PCI, this idea that you have to come back to the source for protect and unprotect. So I have to authorize you. There's no proliferation or sharing of a key out into untrusted boundaries, right? So you always have to come into the trusted boundary. Always have to be authorized by the trusted party.
I mean that's how that Swiss government audit goes, right? I
Right.
mean, basically they're saying you have to come back to Switzerland if you want to get our data, right? No one else can compel you for that. That's huge, right? That's the whole story here. Now, you took it down the rabbit hole, or you started. I'm going to take us further down the rabbit hole. I'd like you to talk a bit more about how tokenization stacks up kind of with encryption or with quantum resistance when it comes to the protection and being able to really see where you landed on this topic.
Yeah. So, and I think we touched a little bit on it. So again, this, when you look at quantum resistance and you look at encryption, I mean, you're looking at the hard problem that you're trusting, or the width or the entropy of the key that you're using, and so all of that ties back to some mathematical property, and so all of that's tested in the hardness in terms of quantum resistance, and so on the tokenization side, you really are, it's this substitution property that takes you away from the mathematics problem. It takes you away from um, the hard, kind of guess, too large prime number problem, and it introduces a significant amount of entropy. And so what I mean by that is, again, instead of a fixed width 256-bit set of information, you have some permutive factorial number that's can't be described by a computer or written down anywhere. I mean, it's infinite, right? It's infinite raised to the power of infinity.
Yeah.
And so what that does is you're left with the entropy of your data, right? And because tokenization is deterministic, it preserves things. I mean, you are leaking information purposely because you have to preserve these things for one reason or another. And so now you're left with, your risk is now um, mitigated down to a smaller radius. which is your data. And there are many different ways to increase your data entropy as well. So
No, I'm glad you let me take us down that rabbit hole a bit because I think something you said there, right, with you're left with the entropy of your data, right? You're no longer worried about compute factor or brute
right,
force or those sorts
right.
of things, right? Because to your point, it's not a mathematical equation at that point that you're trying to solve. So that's really interesting. Okay, so last on the technical side, I'd like to take us maybe a bit onto the consumption, right? We've talked a lot about the protection. How did you think about, or how did you approach things like data authorization or role-based access control? At the end of the day, if all we talk about is locking down data, you can become your own ransomware platform. We got to get the right machines or the right people, the right access at the right time. How did you think about that? How did that work for you?
Yeah, and that does come down to consumption, and that comes back to that self-service model that we talked about. Because I think about this in two ways. So one is sort of the central data model. So I've got 55 different data types that I call sensitive, and I'm going to authorize a set of individuals across these 55 elements, right? Which is valid. But in the cross-border scenario, um, how you treat a phone number, for example, or some set of citizen PII data is very different from one country to another. It's very different from one privacy regulation to another. It's very different from one legal organization or department from another. And so in this model, the way that policy is driven, the way that we think about sensitive data and how we protect and authorize it, it always comes back to the owner of the data. So, as a service provider, we're providing plumbing. So, by way of, in this case, Active Directory groups, for example, scripted and automated policy tied to those groups, owners to those groups, and the owners being the data owner, the app owner, the information security officer, whoever you're defining as the owner. And so, as a central service provider, we're not authorizing anyone to actually see or not see data. We're just providing the plumbing, and the actual owners of the data who know what the regulatory requirements are, who know what the risk is, they're given the power to define who are the members who can see the last four, can see the whole thing, or can't see something, or so we'll define the plumbing in the service that enables that kind of ownership. But and so a way to think about that is, instead of I have 55 elements that I define as secure, it's more about where you define authorization. And so a particular country may define authorization at one level, a different line of business in a different country may define it at another. As long as we can provide in a very efficient, self-service, automated way the plumbing that enables that, all of those things become possible.
So I'm gonna the last question here, and I think I'm gonna take us out of the tech and maybe into kind of more of the operations, the change management side, right? We spent a
Mhm.
lot of time here talking about what you built and what you delivered for really a data protection as a service model to be able to solve cross-border data residency, data sovereignty type challenges. If you could just spend a couple of minutes to explain the how before we close out here. So what I mean by that is, how did you provide a fully delivered, production ready type solution? What was required around that from your side?
Yeah, sure. So this actually hits home with me because I started my career in operations. And so a lot of work goes into and went into operationalizing, I'll call it, this kind of solution. So I mean, that includes all of the architecture work, all of the diagram, how this will be deployed, how does it scale, how does it go into in-country instances and regional and global. So all of that architecture work. Um, from a security side, because now I have the security hat, right? How do we make sure that it's meeting all of the security requirements we want, connecting to HSMs where we need, HSM and physical hardware level security, using all of the different transport encryption methods, and mutual TLS where we need it, and I mean all of the different security things. So ensuring all of that's in there. Um, all of the different logging and views from a risk standpoint that we can now enable. So ensuring that our SOC team and our SEM products are now getting enriched with this data. They can now get alerts on how data is moving, who's doing unprotect and protect and things like that. And then on the operational side, so how do you support this, right? What are the process control manuals for the ops teams? How do you build it? How do you, I'll call it, uh, cookie cutter it, right? For lack of a better term. How do you make it stupidly simple to deploy and support? Okay. And to that effect, I mean, I've talked about the size and the scale and the complexity. This is supported, built, supported, and run in production today by a team no greater than, say, 6 people. And in many cases, and that's not full time, that's looking after other security components as well. So it's a
Well,
small footprint, and it's all of those things and taking all of those things into account that really drive, operationalizing the solution.
and wow, with that footprint and the size and scale you were talking about, with that size of team, that's truly impressive. So, first and foremost, Anthony, thank you for joining. You did all the heavy lifting here. This was great. This was good information. I hope this was painless, at least.
It was. Thank you for having
Okay.
me.
Okay, painless. That's good. And thanks everyone for joining us. We appreciate it. For more information, please visit us at protegrity.com. And we look forward to seeing you on the next Freedom to Innovate episode.
Yes, we do. Thank you.